Welcome, everyone. Welcome, IMGs. This is day 1 of 3 of my USMLE study challenge, okay? The goal here is to study smarter, score higher, and match stronger. If you know anything about me, I'm Dr. Drlum. I am passionate about getting foreign trained physicians positions in residency in the US. And these foreign trained physicians sometimes are Americans who go to foreign medical schools or people like myself who are foreign nationals who have moved to America and have the goal of serving the American people with medicine. So if that is you, you are in the right place. I want you to stay tuned, call a friend, tell them to come on live because we're talking about all things USMLE today. So to recap, this would be a 3-part series. This partnership with IMG Roadmap, which is my signature program that I host every year for international medical students and graduates who are seeking U.S. residency positions. So if that is you, you're in the right place. And if you're logging in from IMG Roadmap's page, we're all connected, okay? So I hope you can still see my screen. I'm going to move a little bit further back because I need you to catch these slides, okay? Catch these slides, would you? All right, let's see how to move forward. So I am a little bit about myself. I'm board certified in family medicine and in emergency medicine. I have over 10 years of practice in the US, both in hospital medicine and more recently in emergency medicine. And I have coached over 1,000 IMGs into US residency. At this point, I've lost count, but these are those that have come through my paid programs, which is my online signature 6-week coaching program. So let's get right into why we're here today, because I want you to score higher and score well. So before I go any further, I have a giveaway, and the giveaway is open right now. I'm giving away one 90-day subscription to USMLE World because I used USMLE World when I was a student and when I studied, and this is not sponsored by them. This is a resource that I know is helpful. It's a resource that helped me go from an 89th percentile on step 1 to a 99th percentile on step 2. So I know how valuable this resource was for me. And I know for many of you who are already studying, you're using a similar resource. So I'm giving away a 90-day subscription of the same resource that helped me tremendously. And in order to enter or join this giveaway, you have to do one thing. Even if you're watching the replay of this, you have to either DM me on Instagram the word giveaway. It's one word. It's not case sensitive, so you can just DM the word giveaway. And 2, you can reply to my stories or under IMG Roadmap, you just type in giveaway. So if you're watching this at a later time, just go on IMG Roadmap's page on Instagram. That's IMG ROAMD IMG Roadmap. I can't spell it, but you know what I mean. RODAMP IMG ROADMEM. Oh goodness, I'm just like, okay, whatever. We're just gonna move forward. But you need to enter the giveaway by typing in giveaway under any of my posts on my page, Dr. Nina Loom, or under IMG Roadmaps page, or replying giveaway to this live if you're online right now, or if you're watching another time, DM me that word. All right. So you'll enter, you'll be prompted by my bot. My bot will prompt you to enter for the giveaway. So you just follow the prompts and you'll be entered. The results will be announced same time next week. So it's going to be open for 7 days and it's going to be random. And we'll give a winner a free USMLE subscription, USMLE World subscription. All right. So who is this for? Today's session, and my neck keeps getting longer. Today's session is for anyone who is in a foreign medical school who's studying for either step 1, step 2, or step 3. Or it can also be for a physician who's already completed medical school and is trying to get in to U.S. residency and is preparing for the USMLE exams from wherever they are. So anywhere in the world, if you're studying for the USMLE, this is for you. And I know I've been doing you guys a disservice because in all my coaching, I've seemed to focus more on getting you into the door of residency. But I'll be amiss if I don't tell you how you can score highly on the USMLE itself, because that is the gateway, that is the entry point. That is the competitive factor. That is where people create an edge. It's with the USMLE scores first. So over the next 3 days, I'm going to be breaking it down to you. And today we're going to start with why IMGs, why students and graduates and physicians fail the USMLE. Because if we can understand the reasons why, then maybe we can reverse engineer. Maybe we could go back in time and fix the problem, right? If we don't get to the root cause of what is happening with our study process, what the psychological gaps are, where we're missing the mark, if we don't get to the root cause of those things, it gets really, really hard to come down the road and just present a personal statement, an LOR, and hope for interviews. My whole goal with any of this is to get you interviews that eventually result in a match. Because without an interview, we can't even talk about a match. And without a USMLE passing score, we can't even talk about an interview. And without setting yourself apart, you can't even talk about being competitive. So you have to set yourself apart by scoring extremely well for your specialty on the USMLE. And when I say extremely well for your specialty, that is because there are different thresholds for different specialties. And there is a way to know that. If you don't know that, we can talk about that tomorrow's live session on how you can distinguish what is the mean score for the specialty that you are interested in. And by mean, it's just an average of what the prior applicants are obtaining in order to get interviews for that specialty. All right. But today we're going to focus on why IMGs, students at foreign medical schools, Caribbean medical schools particularly, but other medical schools outside of the US, suffer or fail or have to do multiple attempts on the USMLE before they pass. And once you have an attempt on the USMLE, that becomes what we call a red flag. And that becomes really hard to overcome even with a good application. So if I can set you up right from the very beginning on how you're approaching a USMLE study, maybe, just maybe, we can eliminate the whole process and pain later on having to deal with coming into preparing an application with a failed score, right? So that's why this is important. Now, the first gap that I notice with IMGs that causes us to fail is we have a core medical knowledge gap, meaning our foundational principles are not solid. So I'll take this and I'll break it down into two categories. The category of the Caribbean medical student first. The Caribbean medical student, the disadvantage that we have is our medical education is disjointed, meaning we start medical school in the Caribbean and then complete it in the US. And I'm coming for those of you who are already graduate physicians because there is a gap there too. And your gap may be advantageous, but it's still a gap. So the gap here with the core medical knowledge issue is, oh, no, we're already on the next slide. Let's go back. So with the core medical knowledge issue, what is the gap there? The gap there is there's a deficiency in how we learn in medical school. Because medical school in the Caribbean has a little bit of a repertoire, or is known to be so fast paced, like you're trying to cover so much material in a short time. Granted, medical school in America is also 4 years, so it's not like it's any shorter. But typically you're completing anatomy within one trimester, and it's just a lot of stuff to assimilate in a very short period. And then we're catapulted into into US clinical environments for our rotations that don't have a set structure in place to support our training and our learning. And that becomes a huge disadvantage for us. And the way that it hurts us the most is it shows up in how we perform, particularly on the clinical skills, or I should say the clinical knowledge section of the USMLE. What I mean by that is, in order to be able to study for the USMLE, you should have had a foundational understanding of the basic science principles from the vantage point of a textbook. So what I mean by a textbook is, if you do not understand in depth the physiologic concepts that you had to learn in physiology, Frank Starling's law, the Krebs cycle, I know we hate those things, the general anatomy, and having a good cadaver to dissect so you could actually assimilate and accommodate all that information that you were learning in anatomy lab. If you didn't have those resources, it gets really, really hard when it's time to do study period and you have 3 months to crank out and memorize all that information. So the knowledge gap that comes as a result of a weaker foundation of basic sciences is one of the key reasons why IMGs from the Caribbean will struggle with the USMLE. So what can you do about that? Reading from textbooks while you're still in medical school is essential. However, when it comes to reviewing for your examination, reading from textbooks becomes cumbersome, and therefore using a review resource, right, is what's essential during that dedicated study period. Giving you an example, when you are in medical school and you're going through the rhythm of M1, M2, M3, M4, that is the key period to study from your textbooks, because that will give you a strong foundation of clinical medicine, a strong foundation of basic sciences, such that when it's time to attack with the review books during your dedicated study period, you have a foundation on what you can review from. One of the mistakes that I see that causes these knowledge gaps is IMGs are reading from review material without necessarily understanding the foundational principles. Now, this problem differs for physicians who are graduates from foreign schools. So, physicians who are graduates from medical schools from India, Pakistan, Africa, South America, Central America, you have had that in-depth study of medicine over the prior 6 years of medical school. So, that may not be your deficiency. The problem for you may be the lag time between when you started medical school and did the basic science curriculum and when you take the USMLE, because there may have been 4 or 5 years in between, and so you're not fresh on the concepts of basic sciences anymore. For that person, the best thing you can do for yourself is finding the right resources to invest your time and energy on. And by resources, you do not want to be inundated with multiple resources. You just need one or two, depending on your weakest areas. And talking about weakest areas, that brings me to the next point. Lack of understanding of the test writer's intent. That's number 2. So when there is a lack of understanding of the test writer's intent, you will answer the questions incorrectly. What I mean by lack of understanding of a test writer's intent is who creates the USMLE, who writes those questions. Number 1, it's the NBE, NBME, so the National Board of Medical Examiners, and specialists from the Federation of State Medical Boards. So there are physicians, psychometricians, psychologists, behavioral analysts, academic professors or whatever of medicine that sit down and create these questions for you. They created it for you. They created it for myself. When I was taking the USMLE, at that time, it was a 2-digit score. I just dated myself. This was 2011, 2010 for step 1. Step 2, I took it in 2013. Step 3, I took it in residency in 2015. At that time, we had a 2-digit score. It has the same effect as what your 3-digit score has right now, which is you have to have a 240 or over. Back then for us, that 240 threshold number was what we called the 99th percentile. So people who scored in the 99th percentile. And that was what we used as bragging rights. So of course, when I did my step 1 and I didn't do well, I had an 89th percentile, or I was in the 89th percentile. For me, that was devastating because that was not competitive. I had to work harder to get a 99th percentile on step 2 CK. And that trajectory of increase was so important because it helped me, I think, secure my interviews to show improvement from step 1 to step 2. So going back to understanding the intent of the question writer is, what are they really testing you for? They're testing your clinical reasoning, not memorization, not what you've crammed and what you know or what you could write an essay on. It's about critical thinking, fast thinking, thinking on your feet. When you do your Q banks, you see that embedded in your question stem. They're not there to confuse you. They're not there to make you, distracted. They're there to give you a real life scenario, because that's how medicine works in the US, where there's so many other distracting factors in your face, even normal vital signs or physical findings that may or may not be related to your presentation or the question at hand. And it's important that you're able to synthesize the question using the intent of the writer, which is, can you filter through the fluff to answer what's important here? They're getting these questions from actual real day, real life clinical scenarios, real life experiences that we as practicing physicians see daily. And they're seeing the roadblocks and they're creating questions around those topics, topics that you frequently encounter, topics that they do not want you to miss, topics that you are very likely to see, and questions that you're likely to answer in real life. So, for example, the next best test, the next best step in management, the next likely thing to consider, the differential you do not want to miss in a presenting complaint. Those are all typical scenarios that physicians have to deal with on a day in, day out when they're practicing medicine here in the US. So then the NBME and the FSMB will create questions to put you in that simulating scenario such that you can think like that person, which is why I posted today on Instagram that if you're taking the USMLE and thinking like a student, you may be, hurting yourself. What they want you to do is think like a clinician who's practicing medicine in the US. But then again, you're in that process of becoming that person. So how else are you going to learn? You're going to learn with active learning scenarios. And that brings me to my next point, which is lack of understanding of the psychology of the USMLE. The psychology of the USMLE is not about tricking you. It's not about making it harder for you to pass the exam. It's about analyzing if you know what's important here. How do you approach a patient scenario? Filter through the mess, the BS, the stuff that's not important, and come down to what the test writer is asking of you, which is what? Next best step, critical thinking. What is the second step after the next step you've already conjured in your mind? What is a treatment plan here? What tests to order? What diagnostics are important? What is in the evidence? What is clinically recommended to do and what is not, right? How to calculate basic biostatistics formulas that are going to be applicable for you every day in your life, like negative predictive values, positive predictive values, giving you scenarios that physicians are seeing every single day. So when you come into the test and you don't understand the psychology of the USMLE, it makes it really hard to pass it, right? Which is why US clinical experience is so important. Because one, I think it's the gateway for preparing you for the USMLE, is having experience in the US, because then you can understand how these writers are coming up with those questions such that you can understand the psychology of the test writer. Okay? If you have a question, drop it in the question box and I will answer them at the very end. The question box is at the bottom. And today's just day one. We have 3 days of this. Okay? This is an intro session. Now, the next point is a disregard for active learning in your test preparation. Active versus passive learning is a huge concept in medical education and in all education, to be honest. Active learning is the process of actually taking questions and using them to study in a manner that fosters critical thinking. Active learning engages more than one area of your brain when it comes to how you study and how you assimilate and accommodate that new information in your brain. Passive learning, on the other hand, does not trigger retention. It does not trigger memory. Passive learning is the process of reading a textbook, just blindly reading it like how you read a novel for comprehension's sakes. That is great for when you are still in medical school, which goes back to the first point of why IMGs fail the USMLE, which is the lack of foundational knowledge core principles. So you need passive learning then to read, to get a general idea, to understand a concept in detail. But when it comes to dedicated USMLE prep, you want to be focused on active learning, which is the learning that is engaging and challenging. And that is by using Q banks and questions early on in your review. And even when it comes to Q banks, there's a method to use a Q bank. My personal recommendation, in order to go from what would be considered, I don't know, a 200 today to a 240, which is what I did practically back in the day, is to use active learning tools such as Q banks. And the way that I recommend you use a Q bank is you start out your Q bank during your clinical year. So I'll break it down again into two categories: career medical students and foreign physician graduate. Career medical student, use your Q banks while you are in your rotation. So let's say you are studying for step 2 CK. And I'm going with step 2 CK because step 1 is pass fail and at this point, you just need to pass it. It's a threshold problem. Step 2 is where you can create an edge with a score distinction. So you can get a 250, a 260, and so on, and make yourself stand out. So knowing that full well, in order to get that, I recommend that you will start out with a Q bank during your first day of M3, so your first day of clinical rotations. And what you're doing is when you are on a certain rotation, let's say you're on a general surgery rotation, you're going to open up your Q bank and you're going to do your general surgery questions under that section. So you following that discipline of surgery during that month of your general surgery rotation. The goal there is as you are learning on the wards, you are completing your Q bank simultaneously. And that is your first pass. And you're going to do this for every single core rotation. So internal medicine, you do the same thing. And even when you're in internal medicine, you break it down. You do cardio, you do respiratory, you do your different systems as you go along. You go into OBGYN, you do the same thing. You go to PEDS, you do the same thing. And you repeat this process over until you complete your course, okay? That is your first pass. And you want to, in order to use your Q bank in an active learning mode, I recommend the first pass you do it in tutor mode, meaning you're going through each question, and as you click the answer, you're immediately met with the shock value of why your answer is wrong or why your answer is right. And do not stop there. One of the mistakes that a lot of students make is they'll stop right there and just say, oh, I got the answer right, means I know the concept. No. I want you to look at the question again after you get the answer right and ask yourself, why did I get this answer correctly? Is it because I understood the concept that the test writer is asking of me? And then you go through option A, B, C, D, and you answer the question of what is this the correct answer to? Or why is this answer incorrect in this scenario? Because that is how you learn. So for example, if the question was, what is the next best step in management? And you picked, it is to order a CAT scan of the abdomen and pelvis or to do nothing and refer to cardiology, then you need to ask yourself, why was option B, C, and D incorrect? Or what is option B, C, and D the right answer for? Right? Because then you're taking it a step further to deduct clinical reasoning. Like, what are they getting to here? And in the question bank, they always give you that educational objective at the very bottom. That is golden. That you can write down somewhere because that is the concept that the test writer is trying to test out of you. But then they give you so many confusing information or so much confusing information and you had to filter through. But what you can do to learn from that is you can say, with this confusing information in option A, option B, option C, what would be what concept will make it correct? Because sometimes they give you like something else, like they'll put in, let's say, an ultrasound instead of the CAT scan, or they put in an MRI, or they put in a DEXA scan as all options. But then if this answer for this question was a CT, where is an ultrasound applicable, right? Where is a DEXA scan applicable? Where is an MRI applicable? Or why is it not applicable in this scenario? That is where you're activating the critical thinking and you're getting your neurons to fire to learn new concepts. For many of us who are physicians, who are graduates from other medical systems like India, Pakistan, West Africa, South America, Central America, where you have a structural or an essay-driven format where you have to defend a thesis or you have to write out a long paragraph to answer questions, it can get really tricky to do multiple choice questions because they're just different. So the more you can practice with question banks, the more you get yourself thinking like an NBME test writer or a FSMB test writer, right? So you go away from passive learning where you're learning to write a longer structural answer or write an essay to learning to understand critical concepts and the breaking points where U.S. physicians kind of meet a stronghold, right? So in our critical decision making, when we're seeing a patient, we have to make a decision to do A or B, right? And that's what they're testing you on. When you get to that roadblock, what path are you going to follow? Are you guys tracking with me? If you're here, please in the comments just tell me yes, or where you're calling from, or what exam that you're taking next. Are you doing a step 3? Are you doing a step 1? Where are you dialing in from? I really want to know. So the next reason why IMGs fail is really why everybody fails. Not only IMGs, even US grads. Test anxiety. And one of the core causes of test anxiety is unfamiliarity. And that is unfamiliarity with the testing environment, unfamiliarity with the testing type questions. So I usually recommend before you take an exam, you should have visited that Prometric site one time before. Why? Because it allows you to at least like just go through, okay, when I come in on into the Prometric Center, this is what I have to do. I'll go here, I'll park here, I'll go here, and I'll do here. And I know this is hard for some of us, especially if you're writing the exam from another country and you have to travel to another country. So for Jemima, who's in Nigeria, she's going to travel to Ghana. For Bright, who's in Cameroon, may have to travel to Ghana, or somewhere else in the African continent or in Europe, or when you're visiting the US. So you may not be familiar with the place. In order to reduce your anxiety, I strongly recommend that you visit a Prometric Center before your test date, just so you can get that out of your system. But that's like the low hanging fruit when it comes to test anxiety. The test anxiety builds up right way before. Right now, there's already test anxiety because what? You're reading the blogs, you're reading the forums, and they're telling you about what your options are or how you don't stand a chance and what's against you and yada, yada, yada. Test taking anxiety can be almost, a psychological problem that requires a specialist, like a mental health resource counselor, to work through. Or it could be as little as requiring just some support from a mentor, a friend, a supportive environment like what I provide within the IMG roadmap. Whatever, the spectrum is really broad. But what I've noticed for me that works for test taking anxiety is to find joy again in my studying. So when I'm reading the question, I'm asking myself, like I literally sink myself into that scenario. Like I'm the doctor, I'm seeing a 2-year-old that comes to the office with the runny nose, their cough, rhinitis, and they give me the vital signs and they give me all these parameters. The mother is saying this and that and the other thing. They were at a play camp last week, and I'm looking for what are the triggers, right? Like, what are the keywords that are standing out? What are the risk factors? And I'm thinking, if I was truly in a clinical scenario shadowing a doctor and we had this 2-year-old come in, what are they trying to test me? Probably bronchiolitis. Probably the fact that they said that the child is immunized or unimmunized should trigger me to pathology that comes in unimmunized children versus immunized children, right? So you want to begin to think like the test writer, but then also you're sinking yourself into the scenario and almost starting to enjoy the studying. And I tell you, when I started doing this, psychologically, I started enjoying my USMLE prep, which I know is like a contrary concept because step one, I was full of anxiety. But for step two, I was determined I was going to understand. And I used also video resources in order to help me because I'm the kind of person I learn a lot by video, which is why I love doing this coaching, talking on lives and whatnot, because this is my method of learning, audio visual. If I can see it, I'm going to remember it. So for me, studying for a question like that and looking at a question stem like that, I would refer now to my video resource, right? And embed myself in that bronchiolitis section, if that was the answer or the concept, the educational objective that they were trying to teach me for that question. I'll embed myself in that and read and watch the bronchiolitis video so that I can understand the different types of bronchiolitis in children and how do I differentiate that from respiratory distress of the newborn, tachypnea of the newborn, those other conditions that I know will be testable concepts for the USMLE, right? So when it comes to test anxiety, things that are helpful is one, embedding yourself into the scenario as if you're a real doctor, like owning it, trying to enjoy the process and thinking about yourself running around the hospital and thinking about yourself like that doctor and you're actually saving a life. I swear it's a psychological trick that will get you to enjoy your studying. The second thing, which is actually, I think, physiologically explainable, is practicing meditation or deep breathing in your studying. So when you find yourself getting really angsty, really nervous, really anxious, take a moment, do some deep breaths, activate that vagus nerve in your neck, right? Slow your breathing down, focusing on your exhalation. So not necessarily just the inhalation, but the exhalation and taking up, counting down from 10 to 1, or even let's say 6, because 10 is really long. But prolonging that exhalation activates your vagus nerve, activates your parasympathetic nervous system so that you can go from fight and flight, which is, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail this test, to rest and digest, which is, I am capable of becoming a physician in the US, and I know what I'm already a physician, actually. Maybe you are in your foreign country. So you're already a physician. So I have what it takes to become a physician in the US, and walking myself through the scenario just like I am a physician in the US, and what would be the right best thing for this child that I'm trying to save in this question stem, right? So you're treating the question stem as if they are a part of who you are, as if they are you, right? So that may help you with your test anxiety, but there's so much more. Seeking help. Obviously, some people require medication, SSRIs. Some people require additional test taking time, right? For those people who have dedicated learning disabilities for any reason, you can work with the NBME and to create accommodations for USMLE. They're really hard to obtain, but they are possible if you have the excuse or the doctor's excuse or whoever assesses your test taking ability, right? Talk to me about that in a DM if you have questions. So, next thing is prior failure on standardized tests such as the MCAT or the COMP. So, anyone who has failed a prior test, right, usually already comes in with their nervous system has already it's been imprinted on a nervous system that they have a probability to fail. And so it makes it more difficult to believe that you have a probability to pass, right? Because your system has been shocked by the fact that you failed MCAT before. And so you think because you struggle with the standardized test in the past, you will struggle again. Not the case. If you've struggled with the standardized test in the past, it doesn't necessarily equate to the fact that you will struggle with the USMLE again. What you can do is find the right resource, which I recommend, again, a question bank of your choice. And to be honest, not all question banks are created equally. And there's so many of them that have been proven track record to be really great at simulating the real test. The closer the question bank is, like for example, the one I'm giving away, the closer it is to what you are simulating for the real day, you're more likely to get into that psychological mental framework to be able to perform on test day the same way you're performing on your Q banks. So again, if you failed on a prior test, that just means you are the kind of person who needs to spend more time focusing on your question banks, focusing on your active learning, using video resources to reinforce concepts, to relearn concepts, and not just review books, which are not going to get you anywhere. The next thing that you're going to do in this scenario of failing standardized tests in the past is you're going to take as many NBMEs until you get to a score that is comparative to the USMLE score that you want. So until you're taking NBME forms, which are those practice USMLE forms that the NBME provides, by this, I don't mean they're not real, they're real. But until you have taken those NBME forms and you get a score that is comparative to the USMLE score that you are aspiring for, you're not ready. So if you have struggled with standardized tests before, failed MCAT or comp in medical school for my Caribbean medical students, or you failed one of the USMLEs before, that means you need to take these Q banks multiple times until your performance is at the level of the score that you're desiring in the USMLE. That is how you prove your readiness to yourself to move forward. All right. The next reason why people fail the USMLE is poor time management. Poor time management. And by poor time management, I mean you don't have a calendar. And what I mean is if what you don't track, you don't progress. Okay? What you don't track, you don't progress in. If you want to perform highly on the USMLE, you have to track your time. And by tracking your time, that means you need to have dedicated time on your calendar for USMLE study. And that includes blocking out important things. And by important things, I mean there may be a season where you are not participating in family functions, you are not doing some things that your family is expecting you to do because you were studying. So you're going to eliminate even the good distractions. Because for many of us, it's not that we have distractions in our lives. Many of us are not out clubbing. Many of us are not out, wasting our time doing nothing. We're actually doing good work. And that good work is taking away from the work that we need to put into taking these practice tests, and Q banks. Okay. You cannot review what you don't know. And so if you're going to need more time to study, relearn concepts that you forgot from first year medical school, then you need to create that time in your schedule. So if you're working a houseman job or house officer job right now in your home country or in another country studying for the USMLE, then you need to be able to figure out when you're going to block time for your dedicated study. You can't just study passively while working and think you're going to show up with a 260. You need a dedicated time blocked out, whether that is 3 months or 3 months of working part-time while studying for the USMLE so that you can dedicate the other half of your full-time work hours to studying, or whether that is 6 weeks within your medical curriculum for my Caribbean students, where you are majority studying, right? But no longer than that, because some people now take 1 year to study for the USMLE, and that is not helpful because you will forget what you are learning by the time you're 6 weeks in. So you want to be able to condense your study periods such that you can you want to condense your study periods such that you can be under that pressure and produce results under that pressure that you can replicate on exam day, because exam day is all about pressure. You're sitting there for 8-9 hours. It's long, it's tiring. If you've not been able to replicate those scenarios before the test, you're going to have a hard time. By replicating the scenarios, I mean, if you're going to write a 9-hour exam, what should you be doing? I think you should have been able to sit for 9 hours studying in order to have the stamina for exam day. So some of us struggle because we don't have the stamina for exam day because we've not been sitting for that long. We've never been able to sit. And I'm not saying you sit for 9 hours continuously, but you simulate the exam where you study for 45 minutes, you leave, come back after 15 minutes, and you continue, and you leave, and you come back, and you continue. And this is again in your dedicated period. I think tomorrow we should talk about a calendar or a schedule that works. And if you're interested in that, just type in schedule below, and we can talk about that tomorrow. Or if you have a topic that you want me to cover during this 3-day summit for the USMLE prep, tell me in the comments so that I know, and tomorrow when I'm coming in, I'm bringing you valuable information for that. But poor time management is one of the key bottlenecks that we encounter. And like I said, sometimes we're doing good work, and good work is no longer sufficient. Good work is not good when it comes to USMLE study. You want to be able to say, no, I'm not going to take you to a family dinner. No, I'm not going to attend that meeting. No, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to be focusing on USMLE study. So I see Makua and Amkin, PBRZ, Mhari. You guys have some really interesting Instagram names. Sejoya, all committing schedule. And if there's anything else you want us to cover in these 3 days, also let me know, okay? Let me know so we cover that. Today we're just focusing on why people fail the exam. Like I mentioned before, good social distractions is another reason. So like I said, family engagements, work projects, other things that are good problems, but there are reasons why they take time away from us. So that being said, I want to just pivot into, now that you know some of these reasons, the summary for today's session is: 1, you're going to find fewer resources to study from. You do not need every resource under the earth. You don't need to have all the flashcards and all the sketchies and all the first aids and every review book for every single discipline, for anatomy, for physio, for biochem, and you're just stacking up more resources and causing problems for yourself. I recommend focusing on question banks first. When you focus on a question bank, your goal is to first go over your question bank in tutor mode. Tutor mode such that you can learn the concepts in depth as you go along. The second pass is in timed mode. And in timed mode is such that you can simulate the test taking environment and the pressure of the test taking environment. And you can do time mode in a systems-based format. The third pass of your QBank is randomized time mode. And that's where you're just going at it in order to build stamina and answer questions because you've understood the concepts. At that point, you know the material and you're just testing to see if you're ready to go take the real test. Next thing with question banks, which is active learning, is you want to take as many NBME forms until you can replicate the score that you are going for with the USMLE exam itself. If your NBME does not reflect the score that you want, you are not ready. Third, but not least, last but not least, is time management. Inappropriate time management is one of the loopholes that's holding you back right now. So start to look at where you can shave off time. If you're working, is it maybe cutting back hours, going part-time, or creating a dedicated study period where you're only focused on the USMLE with a deadline? And another thing is procrastination. Some of us procrastinate so long. We keep saying, I'll do it next year. I'll do it next year. I'll do it next year. And the years just keep passing us by. For procrastination, I recommend you just register for the exam, because once you register, the pressure is on and the clock is ticking. So if you can register for the exam, you get a date, you will block it on your calendar whether you want to or not, and you're going to be ready to go when the time comes. So if you can eliminate procrastination, eliminate social distractions, work on your test taking anxiety by just simulating that environment of the USMLE and having that scenario repeated over again, you will help yourself mentally, psychologically be prepared for the USMLE. Active learning over passive learning every single day. Questions, questions, questions. Did you learn anything today from this live? If you did, drop a yes. If you did not, drop a no. And if you drop a no, tell me what you want to learn more of. I'm ready to take your questions. We'll take questions now for the next little bit before the live is over. What questions do you have? I see Sakshi, Yusuf, Georgie, K.A., Jemima, Niamaka, Adiasa. What questions do you have? Some of the names I can't even pronounce. Salam, Miss Afua, Ifyok, Sylvester. All right. Any questions for us today so we can move? Okay. So it looks like some of you got something out of this. Thank you, Christina, for leaving your feedback. Operation Polished, AMGB 2323, Am Queen, Sejoya, Makwa, Glennis, Jemima. So AMG is asking, gap years due to family issues, how serious red flag is that? So I usually say, how long of gap years are we talking about? Are we talking like a decade, a few months, a year? Life happens to everyone, including the person who is going to review your application. So as much as a gap happens because of family issues, what's most important is how you can explain that in your application later on. So what you can begin to do now is begin to reflect on the lessons learned from that season, so that if you're ever asked to in your application, when they ask you whether your medical school was interrupted or paused or whatever that question is in ERAS that asks you to explain your gaps, you have a clear, logical explanation because you've processed it. Many of us haven't processed the cause for our gaps. Like, we are not able to articulate that in a full sentence. So I want you to do this, journal through it. So write it out. Why does gap happen? Answer the question of what lessons did I learn during this gap period? And then answer the question of how this is helping me become a better physician. And then use those answers to formulate a three-sentence reason for the gap. And that's what you'll put in your application down the road. Okay? So guys, thanks for joining in. I hope you found this helpful, and thank you for your feedback. I don't see any other questions, so we'll go ahead and end for today, and I'll see you guys in tomorrow's live at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time right here on Instagram. All right, bye for now. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to day 2 of my USMLE study challenge. I have my computer down here today. Yesterday I tried using my computer as a, presentation, PowerPoint stuff. It didn't quite work out. So today I'm just gonna have my notes down here instead of having them in front of you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This live is for all my international students at Caribbean medical schools, US IMGs, non-US IMGs, who are working towards step 1, step 2, step 3, particularly the multiple choice section of these exams. As you know, OET is very different. CCS cases in step 3 are very different. And so this is primarily for those working through MCQs, so multiple choice questions, and just some things that have been a game changer for me when I was studying for USMLE. But what you don't forget is, even after residency, there's still standardized testing in the same format, whether that's in-training examinations, which is annually during residency, or the board examinations, which happen at the end of residency. And then even after that, you have maintenance of certification and to maintain your board exams for the specialty that you choose to go into. So the method of addressing or answering MCQs, multiple choice questions, doesn't get to change after you stop studying for the USMLE. So even though it's been over a decade since I took these exams, I can tell you that over a decade, or I've done this for 15 years, of taking different types of exams, there's one method to the same problem. It doesn't matter if it's step 1 or step 2 or step 3. There is one psychological approach to these examinations that can make a distinction between the person who does well, and by well, I mean passing highly, versus the person who doesn't, who fails or just makes it just above average. So these experiences are based on partly my experience going from an 89th percentile to a 99th percentile on the USMLE, but then also from experience from coaching over 1,000 IMGs, 1,000 plus into residency, even those with low scores, even those who had attempts. It is much easier to coach someone into residency with a high score than it is to coach someone who's had an attempt or has a lower score. It's not impossible to get into residency when you have a lower score. However, it is so much easier and worth a high score to already create some level of distinction in that standardized testing program. So I want to go into sort of talking to you guys today, or we're really just discussing methods and strategies and frameworks that you can implement when you are practicing or studying for the multiple choice component of the exam. So welcome, you guys. I see some people joining us. Mayor's Pride, Dr. Sel, Orfria, Farina, Brunhilda, Shazis, Abigail, my little niece, Amanda, okay, Ope, Dr. Ope, sorry, it's wanting me to block someone, but no. Jemima, welcome back. So welcome back to today. I want to let you know, please drop a question in the chat box. I'm not going to sync with IMG Roadmap tonight. We'll just repost this video on IMG Roadmap later on. But ask a question below. And if you don't have a question, tell me what exam you are studying for. Because the last thing I want is to spend the next 30 minutes on live talking to myself, right? So talk to me back. I'm human, okay? I'm human. I have blood going through my veins. So talk to me back. Let this be some kind of conversation. Bright Eye, do you really want to be a part of my life? Or, not my life, but my IG live? Send me a question or tell me, what are you studying for? If nobody answers that question, I'm not going to continue, okay? I'm not going to keep talking if you guys are talking back at me, because I am talking to myself and that's no fun. All right, refine dual steps to 2CK, so we can focus on that, which is the clinical knowledge portion. And as you guys know, step 2CK has now taken over as the benchmark for most specialties, especially the medical and surgical specialties. Surgical specialties still do look at step 1 heavily, but with it being pass-fail, it has sort of leveled the playing field for most everyone now. So step 2CK is now like the threshold that programs will use as a distinguishing factor on selecting who to interview. So like we discussed yesterday, it's all about selecting the right candidate to interview and having what programs want when they're doing the initial selection. Because if you don't get selected for an interview, you're just not going to make it onto the match. We think of the match as the end point, but the match is actually a result of having interviewed. And so when I'm coaching my students inside the IMG Roadmap, I'm usually coaching them to get interviews because that's the first achievable step. Because once you get interviews, I can easily coach you on how to interview and convert a program later on. So let's see. I have step 1. Most people are studying for step 1. I see one step through step 3 with Dr. Claire. Hey, Dr. Claire. I believe that's Dr. Claire from my program. Okay. How was interview? How was rank order listing going? Tell me more. And step 1. So let's go into a thinking framework. Before you start studying for any USMLE exam, the first challenge, and nobody would tell you this, But the first challenge I think you should do for yourself is to take an NBME form. What we're told to do is to take an NBME form at the end of our QBank in order to assess our learning or what we've learned from the QBank. But I think if you encounter an NBME form at the end of your dedicated study, you are a little bit late on that. And what I mean by you being late on that is if you take an NBME form before you even start your study for that examination, you will be able to do this key thing. You'll be able to identify your weakest areas such that you can reverse engineer your learning process, your exam preparation process, and focus on what is most important. So if you're studying for step 3, take an NBME of step 3 before you start your dedicated step 3 study. Because you already have a foundational step 2 CK knowledge, a foundational clinical understanding, a foundational medical knowledge. So you want to test where you're at relative to step 3 before you start your dedicated. Same thing with step 2 CK for refined jewel. You're going to start by challenging yourself to do an NBME form when you're not ready. Why? If you do an NBME form first, you'll already be able to identify your weakest areas based on your clinical knowledge. So I'm assuming if you're a third-year medical student at Caribbean Medical School, right? You've done your core rotations or you're doing your core rotations. Yesterday, we talked about doing your QBank simultaneously with your examinations, with your rotations, such that you're testing your knowledge as you go in tutor mode, which is more of the learning mode where you're reading through every educational objective, you're reading through the answers and synthesizing why A is incorrect and why B is correct and why C, D, and E are incorrect. So while you're doing that process, it is imperative that before you go into your CK dedicated, you've tested yourself to see, based on my step 1 study, where am I now? You take an NBME and you see where you're at. Then it would give you your score report and it would tell you your weakest areas and your strongest areas. It's important that you can distinguish between your weak areas and your strong areas because that would inform the schedule that you make for studying for the next exam. If you're studying for step 1, you're not exempt from that as well. You will do an NBME form of step 1 before you start. Because guess what? If you're in Caribbean Medical School, you have already done basic sciences, so you should be able to answer those questions correctly, right? If you are in 4th-year medical school in Ukraine or in Japan or wherever, you should have already had your basic foundational sciences completed, so you have the ability to test in or test out with an NBME. But the key is just not taking the exam. You're taking the exam with one goal in mind. And the goal that you have is to ascertain your level, know your weaknesses versus your strengths. Because we're all doctors or student doctors. We're not dull people. We're very smart people. We're not stupid. So we know exactly how to assess our strengths versus our weaknesses. But we don't want to play on our strengths. We want to work on our weaknesses. So when you get your score report, right? And I'm going to pull up a sample score report from the NBME on my computer such that I can describe this to you very well. So let's say sample score reports for NBME images. Okay. So it would give you a sample score report and it would tell you, oh, this is kind of a shrunken screen, but let's say, okay, I have to pull the computer close to my eyes. So it will give you performance based by system, performance based by discipline. So that would allow you to know my weakest areas are, for example, gross anatomy and embryology, pathology, and physio. My strongest areas are biochem and genetics and behavioral sciences. What you're going to do with that information is now you can sit down and say, I'm going to create my schedule for studying for my exam. And you're going to take your weakest areas on your NBME and attack those first. And the way that you attack the questions from your weakest discipline or system It's different from the way that you attack the questions from your strongest system or discipline. And if an area, if you score highly on a certain section, it doesn't mean that you don't get to study that section anymore. It just means that you are performing better on it on an exam, and so you can spend less time on that section. The difference between a person who scores a 260 and a person who scores a 240 is that the 260 is scoring high on concepts that the person in 240 failed or did not get correctly. So that person has a distinctive factor. They're getting these questions that are difficult to pass. So the questions that are considered on a rating of 1 to 5, the most difficult questions, that 260 person is getting them correctly. And people who do that typically have mastered where their weaknesses are, and they've learned to get their weaknesses into an area of strength. So going back to this example we're talking about, let's say that first NBME that I did to shock my system, because literally that's what I'm doing. I'm shocking my system so that I can see where my weakest areas are. I shock my system with an NBME. I have not even started my dedicated yet. And so I say, okay, pathology, physio, and pharmacology are my weakest areas. So when I go into my Q bank, what am I doing? In my Q bank, I'm going to sort questions from one of the weakest disciplines first. So I start with the weakest, and I say, okay, I'm going to sort questions from pathology first. I set my Q banks, tutor mode. This is first pass, tutor mode, with the goal of studying for the educational objective. It's not about getting the questions right or wrong. The mistake you're making is your first pass, you're trying to get questions right. No. Your first pass of your Q bank is you're studying to get an understanding of the educational objective. The educational objective in every question is what is known as the high yield concept that you must know. So, for example, when you're reading sketchy or you're reading first aid or you're reading or you're studying Anki flashcards, they're giving you just the high yield concepts. So the frequently tested concepts from these exams. And these frequently tested concepts are taken from real life, real day scenarios of the most encountered problems that we as physicians will meet every single day. So let's say that you're working on your pathology. How are you going to do that? You're going to take your Q bank and you're going to say, how many questions of pathology are in my Q bank right now? So when you sort your Q bank by questions, you may have a total of 2,500 questions on your Q bank in average. And then you may have about, let's say, 500 of those are under pathology. And this, I'm just using whole numbers because it's easier. So let's say I have 500 numbers, 500 questions under pathology, and pathology was my weakest area. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I have 3 months to study for the exam, or 4 months, or whatever it is, the time frame that I'm using. How can I get through this Q bank at least 2 or 3 passes of UWorld? So I've gone through the entire Q bank one time, and then I'm going through it again a second time. You want to do a minimum of 2 passes up to 3 passes. Some of us need 3 passes. I need 3 passes on the Q bank. That's just me. So let's say I decide there are 500 questions of pathology. So if 500 questions, let's say one block could be 45 questions. So that means if I set, how many blocks do I need to set in order to get 500 questions completed? So for 500 pathology questions, 45 questions a block, I need at least 11 blocks to finish my pathology. So let's say 11 blocks now, that's about an hour per block, but this is not what I'm going to do my first round. I'm not going to do an hour, maybe longer. But at least I'm going to set 45 questions per block. And so what I'm going to do next is I would say, okay, now that I know 500 questions in pathology, which is my weakest area, I'm dividing that by 45 questions, which is the number of questions per block. That leaves me with, I need to do 11 blocks of pathology. In a day, how realistic is it for me? How many blocks can I do in one day that is realistic? Okay, so reverse engineer that process. In one day, I could probably do realistically when I'm starting out, maybe 1 or 2 blocks. But as I progress and I'm no longer in tutor mode and I'm now in time mode, I may be able to do 2 or 3 blocks. So the first pass is not about speed, it's not about efficiency, it's not about getting the questions or the answers correctly. It's about just getting a learning understanding of the educational objective in each question. Once you change their mindset about that, you begin to enjoy your learning. You begin to enjoy your Q bank. And until you get to a point where you are really engaged in your studying in a way that it's like so mentally stimulating that you love what you're learning, I tell you, you'll be miserable every time you study. And that's one thing I've learned is I've learned to romanticize medicine. in a way that if I'm reading an article, I'm looking for an article next to me. If I'm reading something and I'm being told, for example, in the ER, I was told the other day, well, we have to start doing this particular protocol. Well, instead of me just adopting that protocol, what do? I said, let me find the article, the research paper where this protocol is adapted from so I can study it. And maybe if I get a deeper understanding, then I'll enjoy doing this protocol. And when you start to enjoy the concepts and you're reading an MCQ and you're like engaged and you're thinking of yourself as that doctor taking care of that patient, what you're doing is you're framing a scenario in which you're embedding yourself in that real case patient care. And it's so much sweeter to where you really want to learn and you really want to know the right answer. Like I'm talking about USMLE and I'm feeling so good. It's kind of embarrassing. It's embarrassing. Okay. But you know what I mean, right? When you're enjoying medicine, you're enjoying your book, you're enjoying your studying. So back to how we're gonna attack pathology, right? I started like basically like fantasizing about studying. It's weird. So you take 500 questions and you divide them by 45. So now you have 11 blocks. My first pass, because it's not about getting the right answer, it's about learning the educational objective. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do one block a day, maybe two, okay, if I can get there. And so with that, that would look like for pathology, I'll set myself one block in tutor mode. So as I'm reading the question and answering it, I'm getting that shock value right there. Like, bam, you feel the question, you got it right. What I like about tutor mode for your first pass, especially in your weakest areas, is that it allows you to get kind of like a jolt to your nervous system, right? You know when you're nervous about, oh, did I get the right answer? Did I get the right answer? And then bam, it's in your face. Use that to your advantage because your brain is likely to remember negative experiences. That's just how our brains work. Our brains capture the negative and we just dwell in it. That's why it's so easy to remember all the times people have gossiped about you, all the times people have spoken negatively about you. You remember that way more than the compliments people give you every single day, right? The critique you get, the negative feedback. You remember it because your brain, okay, your emotional brain, your limbic system is more likely to hold on to those. So I like tutor mode because my brain's already defaulted to like seeing like you got the question wrong or some kind of negative feedback, right? So I'm reading the cube bank stem, and then I hit the answer I think is right based on my elimination. And I use elimination a lot with MCQs. Whereas I'm going through the question I'm asking first, what I do, I read the last sentence of the question. So I always look for what is the question. It's usually what is the next best step in diagnosis? What's the most likely diagnosis? How would you address this scenario? Who would you consult? What is the next step in management? What would be your recommendation? What would you tell this patient? So questions in the USMLE are always a what question. So a WHAT question or a why question, a rationale question. So in the STEM, I'm looking for what is the rationale? What are we heading to, right? Once I identify what that is, as I'm reading option A, I'm ruling in or out how that is the right answer or the wrong answer. And as I'm doing that, I'm striking through. A is not the one, B is not the one, C is not the one. Maybe it's D and E I'm kind of sorting out through. Then I go back to the question to skim through to see which one differentiates or makes A, D, or E distinguish itself from the other, right? So in the process of doing that, you hit the answer you want, and then you see your responses. That moment, that flip second where you see those responses is so crucial because what we tend to do is we just want to read why we got the answer wrong and move forward. No, 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 no. That is where you sit down and you say, okay, now, A was right, but I got B as I picked B. Why did I choose A? You're almost talking to yourself. Why did I choose A? Right? And as you're talking to yourself, you realize I chose A because I thought this was a question about Fanconi's anemia, but it's a question about hemolytic anemia or something else, right? And so now you're thinking, because they put the Coombs test here, because they put the peripheral smear here, because they showed me this slide, that's why I got it wrong. That is good to be able to troubleshoot and go back to your root cause. But that's not the point of the question. Now, you know, okay, I got that question, I got it wrong because I was thinking of this instead of this. This is where you go into your review resource material, whether it's a video resource. I love video resources because I'm a visual person. I love this kind of stuff. And so it's easier for me to watch a video from Conrad Fisher, for example, and understand the different kinds of anemia, right? Because he has explained it to me so well, than it is for me to read a review book on it right now. But if you're a review book kind of person, do that. Do what works best for you, right? If you're a textbook kind of person, go in your textbook. This would be perfect. Go and read the chapter on autoimmune hemolytic anemia versus Fanconi versus iron deficiency versus all the different types, and then create those distinguishing factors. Whatever you need to do to remember the concept, you do that. But because you got that question wrong, you spend some time. You may be spending 10, 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes even, because now you're going through your textbook and referencing the different types of anemia to make sure that you have key points on why this is right and why this is wrong. Another thing I do with that first pass is I get a spiral bound notebook, and I keep looking around because I always carry a spiral bound notebook with me everywhere I go, and I can't find it right now. But I'm sure you guys saw my messy background, but whatever. But I find a spiral bound notebook. I don't have one, but let's just use this. And I start writing, making notes for myself. So I make my own first aid, basically. And I'm making notes for myself saying, based on this question that I got wrong, what is the educational objective? So they're trying to teach me about the different kinds of anemia. So now in my notebook, I'm going to write about what I've learned from iron deficiency anemia that's different from Fanconi's, that's different from autoimmune hemolytic anemia, that's different from sickle cell anemia, that's different from this other kind of anemia, right? And I'm writing the distinguishing factors. And for that, it may be a table where you're writing ferritin high, low, schistocytes present, absent. You have all the parameters on one axis and then present in this versus not. Whatever it takes for you. If you're a visual person, you're drawing it out, that's fine. If you're a writer, you're writing it out. But writing in your process, writing when you're studying, helps with memory retention because the act of writing fosters active learning. Okay. So when you're able to write, you will remember things more, okay, than the person who is reading passively. Okay. So active learning in what do they call it? Pedagogical research. So the research of how people study has been shown time and time again to help learners create meaningful associations with what they're studying. It promotes an environment of involvement. So the fact that you're able to sit down and learn by writing, by problem solving, you will be more likely to retain that information because it involves reflection, it involves experience, it involves writing, which is an act that your brain is taking memory of. There's something about connecting your hand to your brain, right? Like that helps you retain concepts so much better than just reading them. And the purpose of that spiral bound notebook is so that when you're going through your UWorld or whatever QBank you're using again the second time, and you get an anemia question wrong, you remember what you wrote in your book and you will be able to remember the concept that you were differentiating in your book. So you see how that's helping you with memory retention? But then more importantly, it is helping you remember to reference your own notes and read them. Another thing I do with my spiral bound notebook, and I did this when I was in med school a lot, was I would take it on buses, on the bus with me. I would take it on the train with me. I'll take it because I had long commutes to go on rotations and stuff. So I'll be reading my spiral bound notebook in the bus, in the train. If I was going to an event and there was going to be a wait time at airports, bus stations, wherever I was, I had one of those notebooks because I was going to hold on to it and read it. And what I did was I went to a dollar store and I bought the notebooks, the $1 notebooks for each discipline. So you know how the exam report breaks it down by discipline. So I have one notebook for path, one for physio, one for farm, one for microimmuno, one for biochem. And there are certain disciplines that you don't go through the entire notebook, but something like path, you may go through a whole notebook. Genetics, you're probably not going to go through a whole notebook, so you can use genetics and behavioral together, But having one notebook is so that it was easy for me to always put my pathology concepts in one paper. So somebody's dropping us a tip here, PBRRZ, pro tip, write on pencil the first time and then rewrite over again with pen. There you go. Because that's going to help you remember. I think it's going to help you with your memorization and your remembering very well. So now that we've talked about that, that's how you're going to approach your weakest areas on the NBME. So to recap, Before you start your dedicated, you're going to take an NBME for shock value. So you're doing it so that you can know what your weakest areas are. And then you're going to reverse engineer your learning by starting with your weakest disciplines first on your QBank. And you're going to start first with your tutor mode so that you can learn as you go. When you go through all your weakest disciplines, so you do path, you finish that, you go to physio, you finish that, you go to micro, you finish that, then you start working from your weakest down to your strongest. And you'll notice your weakest, you may spend the first day, you may be on you may be on one, what did they call them? One block. So one block of 45 that we talked about, you may do that for one day. Like your whole 6 hour study, maybe one block. That is okay. It's your first pass. Be patient with yourself. You are learning. You are getting better. That's all that matters. Okay. Your next block, you do that until you go through 11 blocks. So it may take you 1 week to do path, right? Because you're doing one block a day. But what you're going to learn will help you such that your next second pass on your QBank, you'll notice you'll probably spend 2 or 3 days on path. And you wouldn't be that long on path like you were before because you spent all the time needed referencing your textbooks, um referencing your video resources, referencing tutoring online, referencing whatever you use to study. But remember, you cannot review what you don't know. I'll say that again. You cannot review that which you do not know. You only review concepts that you have studied and learned on the back of your PAM. If you don't know it that well and you can't teach it to somebody else, you're not ready to review it. You're ready to study it. So that studying is an in-depth reading process where you're going through a textbook, a video resource to understand the concept. A review is when you're doing an overview of something that you know. Are you tracking with me, guys? All right. Ask me a question. I've talked and talked and talked, and I want us to I want us to be in communication. This is a two-way street. I feel like I'm talking to myself. So I'm gonna just wave at some of you again in the room. Ask me a question. All right. So the NBME uses what is known as psychrometrics, and that is where they analyze which distractors high scorers use. So a high scorer is someone who's scoring, highly. Those people that are rare that are scoring 260 and whatnot. So they analyze what distractors. So if someone is scoring that high, what was the distraction in the question? Which wrong answers low scorers pick, because that tells them, okay, if most people that score low are picking this answer, then there must be a deficiency in what people are learning, right? And so let's structure our questions accordingly. They also analyze how discriminating each question is, because each question has to test one particular specific concept, which are those high yield concepts that we talked. So if you're doing a question and you're thinking this is the attractive answer, then you're actually doing what they're thinking you will do, which is you are replicating the fact that they know that this is an attractive answer, but it's wrong. And so what you need to ask yourself in that moment is, if this is the right answer, why is it the right answer? And how do I distinguish this one from this one from this one? That is critical thinking when you're thinking 2 steps ahead, which is all about what the USMLE wants from you. They want to make sure that you're thinking way ahead in the process. Another thing I see a lot nowadays is people using AI to study. And most QBanks will tell you do not put our questions in AI, which you shouldn't, because they don't want you to do that. And that is fine and fair. But I think you can use AI in this critical reasoning process, which is the prompts that I will be putting in AI after I get a question wrong wouldn't just be like, tell me the right answer. No, it would be, explain to me why answer A is correct for this particular type of scenario versus answer B. Or explain to me as like a fifth grader so I can understand why Fanconi's anemia is this and this and this. Or what must I remember about this particular condition for studying for USMLE Step 2 CK so that I don't get questions on this incorrectly on the exam. Those are the prompts that I'll be putting into AI. I wouldn't be putting the question stem, but I'll be troubleshooting, like, okay, where in my thought process have I gotten questions incorrectly? How many of you actually use AI in your studying? I'm kind of curious if you do or not. But I feel like that is a great way to use AI, is to find loopholes in your learning, so that you're not just like falling for those traps that they know, like I said, the psychometrics of what are high scorers, like what is the trap that they're falling into, and low scorers, what are the traps they're falling into, and then they're testing us on those concepts over and over and over again. But once we identify what those are, then we can understand, okay, for example, with the Krebs cycle, they're always going to be testing this and this and that, or they'll be testing along these lines. So I need to make sure I understand it entirely, such that no matter where they break it down for me, I can answer the question correctly. So and another way to approach it is, like, most USMLE questions are going to be asking you about like classic presentation. So they're trying to know the diagnosis, or the diagnosis is given and they want to know what's the next step in management, or they give you a diagnosis, but they want you to explain the mechanism of how that diagnosis comes about. Or they give you a risk factor and they want to know if you understand the complication, or they give you an intervention and they want to know if you know what the adverse effects are. So again, if you're using AI, when you're reviewing your blocks and stuff, you can ask yourself, for this diagnosis, what is the adverse effects that I want to remember? Or I should say, for this treatment plan, what are the adverse effects that I must remember for the USMLE? And sometimes it's already in your educational objectives. So sometimes you don't even need to use AI for it. But if you are, those are the better ways to use it for critical thinking, specifically, I think, for knowing why you picked the wrong answer. So Jemima says, what would you suggest to someone who always narrows the answers to the two best answers but still picks the incorrect one? I would ask myself at the end, after I know that this is the incorrect one, what was the attractive factor in the one that was incorrect that led me down that path? Right? So if I get down to two answers and I pick one out of, like, I'm just going to pick something by elimination, and I get it wrong, then I'm like, what attracted me to this question? And then the second step to that question is, the thing that attracted me to that question, what is it the right answer for? Because more often than not, when you narrow it down to two options, the answer you picked is the right answer for something else, or it would be the right answer if the stem was different. So if you can take it that second step further by saying, why did I pick this question, right? But then, what is this the right answer for? And sometimes you can almost even rewrite it and say, oh, if they had tweaked it this way, it would be the right answer for this question. But because this is a 12-year-old, this is not the right answer, right? Especially when they test you like about Osgood-Schlasher disease or Legg-Perthes-Carvis syndrome and things like that, right? Where the age difference can be the distinguishing factor, or the presentation of the pain, the laterality of it, or the associated symptoms could be this distinguishing factor, maybe in the same age group, right? So it's important that you look at it and say, I got the answer, I narrowed it down to two, and I picked the incorrect one. But what was I thinking to pick the incorrect one, for one? Second, what would that my thought be the right answer for? So that you can therefore know, okay, I got it wrong on this time because I was thinking this, but it's this. That means I know that concept, but I don't know this concept that they're trying to teach me here. Because more often than not, there's one differentiating factor that you're missing out on. So I think that for tonight, I want to just kind of give a brief summary, and we end here. Yeah, Benny says, I use AI only when I need more explanations. So I like that. And did you find this section helpful? If you do, or session helpful, if you do, we'll meet back again tomorrow. And what do you want to hear about tomorrow when it comes to USMLE? And I will bring it for you. I'm going to keep these in bite sizes. Maybe we'll go longer than 3 days. Maybe we go shorter. Yeah, probably longer than 3 days. But do let me know what you found most helpful here, how this was helpful for you, if it was, and what you're going to implement moving forward. And I'll see you guys tomorrow for day 3 of our live on USMLE. I'm keeping them short so that it's easy for people to watch the replay and to be able to follow along. So Jemima, thanks for communicating with me. You make me feel like a human being. I appreciate that. And let's see, somebody added themselves. Oh, well, you got a question? Okay, Shizzy says yes, very helpful. Las de toi says thank you, Dr. Loom. All right, this person was not ready maybe for this request. That's fine. Um, someone says I need to shock my system more. Yes, you do need to shock your system more. It helps. It helps with memory retention. Um, I think that's a great way to use anxiety and fear to your benefit is by helping with memory retention. So I'm going to leave you guys here for tonight. And tomorrow I want to talk about test anxiety, how we can work on that a little bit more. And also, I promised to bring you guys some kind of a sample schedule, but we'll bring that on tomorrow. Dr. Claire, how many interviews do you end up getting? Send me an email. I want to know. And I want to know your rank list. How did you rank your programs? You didn't tell me. Let me know. Um, should I spend hospital email that I'll be participating in SOAP? Should I send hospital? No, you don't have to send. No, you don't have to do that because you don't know yet if the program will have a position open in the SOAP. The SOAP would only be applicable for that program if they have openings. So if a program fills all their spots, they wouldn't have SOAP openings for you. So if you send an email now, it's not helpful. It's not going to help you. So do not send a hospital an email that you will be participating in the SOAP. It is not wise, first of all, because that already says you didn't get interviews. They don't need to know that. They don't need to know your private business. They also don't need to be looking at you like somebody who is not competitive enough to have obtained interviews this cycle. They don't need that. Because and then thirdly, you just wait until the SOAP results are out. Once you know that there are openings there, then you apply there. When studying for step 3, is it better to go with random, timed versus subject based? So step 3 is a bit different because you already have a foundation for step 1 and step 2. So I again recommend starting with an NBME form so that you can know your weakest areas. And then based on your weakest areas, you're going to go with subject based on your weakest areas only. And then you can do random timed second pass after you've reviewed your weakest areas. Subject based helps you with your weakest points first. And then timed random is helping you with your test stamina and like actual real life dedicated studying. Does that make sense, Chedzi? Is that helpful? Because subject based will help you improve your weakest areas before you start doing random timed. Because you do random timed, what's going to happen is you're going to get the questions you know, the answers you know correctly, but the ones you don't know, you get them wrong. But if you can consolidate everything you don't know into one area, it'll be helpful in your learning because and question 1, 2, and 3 in the same subject will help you understand that subject in general. Then doing randomly over time and realizing, oh, I'm weak in pathology down the road and I have to go back, or in cardiology, I should say, and I have to go back and study all of cardiology again. Shed ZY04, is that helpful for you? Please respond. I'm talking to myself over here. Okay. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Same place, same time. And oh, Shedzi says she's worried about wasting. You're not wasting it. It's not wasting if you're learning from it. But, it's all about how you think about it. If you feel like you're wasting it, then I don't know. But you're not wasting, you're learning from it. Another thing you can do is, okay, save those NBMEs and do one of the, like, for example, you can buy one of the commercial NBME forms or the test forms from, like, I don't know, UWorld. Some of them have like a sample NBME kind of deal where it's a bunch of questions. You can do it that way. Or if you don't want to waste it, you could just start with another testing platform that allows you to do some kind of simulation of step 3 and then the key is to get your weakest areas and start working on that. And I don't want you to feel like you're wasting because you're learning from it. But, it's all about how you think about it. So I'll see you guys tomorrow, same time, same place. Bye for now. Of my USMLE study challenge, and I feel like I haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg on all that I could teach you when it comes to preparing for high stakes examinations, particularly the multiple choice question section of the exam. because that is where we find the most trouble with test taking anxiety, overthinking, self-doubt. All those things show up more on the MCQs than anywhere else in the series of these exams. So on day one, I gave you a recap, an overview of the most common reasons why students, and not even only IMGs, but just in general, reasons why medical students struggle with the USMLE. And we sort of reverse engineered what we could do based off of what those common reasons are. What steps should we be taking now to avoid those mistakes? Yesterday, I went into a more in-depth overview of how to best approach your dedicated study period when you're using multiple choice questions. So the key take-home point yesterday was I challenged you to shock your system. And shocking your system means you're going to take an NBME form before you start your dedicated study period. And Hassan, this right here is the step 2 tip you're looking for. You start your dedicated, and if you haven't already, I challenge you to stop what you're doing and take an NBME form, because that will reveal to you before you get in the weeds of studying what your weakest areas are. A lot of us start studying and we're studying everything with the same intensity all at once. And that is exactly how you don't make a distinction in the change in your score. If you take randomized blocks and you take 20 randomized blocks and you already know 50% of the material, you'll always get 50% score pass rate on all those blocks. However, if you take an NBME beforehand, determine what your weakest areas are, start with your weakest areas first, focusing on studying those in depth in a tutor mode format. And for that, you're doing both active and passive learning. You will notice that by the time you're doing a second PAX and you're doing randomized timed blocks, you'll no longer score 50% of the time. Like, you will no longer get 50% of the questions correctly. Then you shift the needle from the 50% that's your benchmark to maybe a 75% based off of 25% on working on your weaknesses. So, when studying for the USMLE, specifically the multiple choice questions on step 1, step 2, and step 3, first thing I want you to do is identify your weaknesses and work from your weaknesses, reverse engineer, work backward. So once you know what disciplines you're weakest in, it's more likely that you can shift your score from 60% to 80% just by focusing on the weakest areas alone. The second thing that I want us to talk about today, which is sort of the goal for today, is really test-taking anxiety and strategies that you can implement to begin to work on test-taking anxiety. Anxiety is a very common condition. It obviously affects over 44 million people in the United States at different levels. For a lot of us who are high performers, before we went to medical school, we used to do really well in our regular undergraduate or college or bachelor's degree program, or even in high school for those of us who left high school directly and went into medical school. So you are probably familiar with being thought of as a smart person at baseline. You're familiar with thinking of yourself as somebody who knows how to take a test because you've taken so many tests and you've done so well. However, when it comes to USMLE, there's something about our future, right, that is dependent on this test that makes the anxiety level so much harder, okay? And because the stakes are high and our future seems to be threatened, we're more likely to experience a higher level of anxiety with the USMLE compared to maybe even the MCAT or the comps, for those of us who are Caribbean medical students or those of us who went to medical school here in the U.S. before pursuing, undergraduate in the U.S. before pursuing medical school abroad. So it's important that you first address a few things. Address your past history with test taking. So ask yourself, is my anxiety a root cause of the fact that I've been exposed to failure before? If your anxiety is as a result of prior failure, and then it's more of a sort of quote unquote traumatic response where because you failed before, you're worried about failing again, there's only one thing that I know in the literature that is super helpful for that: behavioral therapy, if you can afford it. So cognitive behavioral therapy is proven to help people overcome those roadblocks, overcome the mindset blocks that make them only see themselves through the lens of past failure. And some of that is rooted in neuroscience because our brain is adaptable to negative experiences first before positive experiences. So you're not crazy for seeking help when it comes to, taking in behavioral therapy for dealing with test taking anxiety when it's based on proven track record of failure from the past. Now, for those who cannot afford anxiety services, or I should say cognitive behavioral therapy services, you may want to research in your area if there are any pro bono pro bono mental health services that you may be able to benefit from. If you're located in the United States, you'd be surprised what is available for you in your state. If you're searching specifically for charitable organizations, non-governmental organizations, or pro bono services that can help with that. Hassan asked me, how about beta blockers for anxiety? I refer you back to your primary care physician because beta blockers are not for everybody. There are several other factors that influence what a beta blocker can do for you, including but not limited to like low blood pressure and other things like that. So you should talk to your doctor for your unique scenario to determine if that is a right fit for you. Same thing with SSRI, same thing with anxiolytics, and so on and so forth. That is typically case dependent, and your doctor should be able to guide you around that. The second thing that you want to deal with when it comes to test taking anxiety is your internal self-talk. So that is that internal dialogue, the things that we tell ourselves about ourselves, such as telling ourselves like we're not great test takers, maybe because we struggled with step 1, or telling ourselves that we're not good enough on this particular format of testing because it's new for us or because it's different. And sometimes it's what we've been told, maybe by our preceptors, our teachers, or professors who've ingrained in us that maybe we're just not great at taking tests, right? If you've always scored averagely, you always see yourself as an average student. But that's the mistake that you're making, is letting yourself be defined by that internal dialogue. Because your internal dialogue primarily is driven by the dialogue of other people bestowed upon you. So what other people have said about you is more likely to be the reason why you are perpetually walking through the same problems over and over again, because you're more reliant on the perspective of others compared to your own perspective. Even, for example, on a live like this, I'll come on and I'll give my recommendations for how to study, but it's not one size fits all. It may work for one person, it may not work for another person, which will bring me to my third point, which we're going to get to. But back to internal dialogue and internal self-talk, what you're telling yourself is going to define your outcome. Because if you wake up in the morning, whether you believe it or not, the next action that you take when you first wake up in the morning is based on what you just told yourself to do. So I'm going to wake up and take a shower. I'm going to wake up and scroll down my phone in bed for an hour before I know time is gone, right? And we talked about time management as one of the key roadblocks that IMGs hold or face when they're studying for the USMLE. But your internal dialogue makes a big, big difference. Because if you're walking around already with a preconceived notion of yourself, all you're going to do is replicate and bring that to the surface. We are a product of our thoughts. Whether you believe it or not, your circumstances are not factual. They're just there, right? You manifest the things that you think about your circumstances. So if you failed a comp before or you failed a test before, it does not equate to the fact that you will continue to fail tests. However, your internal dialogue, because your system, your nervous system, your fight and flight system has already become familiar with the humiliation, the shame of failure, you fear that shame reaction. You don't want that to happen. But contrary to what you would want to do is you want to create a different life for yourself, right? However, your nervous system has remembered and knows exactly what it feels like to fail. And in some absurd way, instead of working toward a pass, you're held back more so with the thought of shame and failure than you are with the thought of success. And it's so counterintuitive when you stop and think about what you're thinking about. A lot of times we're not thinking about how am I going to succeed on this exam? How am I going to come up with the 250? Instead, we're thinking about, oh, I had a 198 on the step 1. It's like I'm doomed. Like I have a problem with test taking. If you continue to tell yourself you have a problem with test taking, guess what's going to happen? You will have a problem with test taking because you're going to go in the direction of your most prevalent thoughts. So we always think that our outcome is a result of, like, I don't know, other people's wishes upon ourselves. But our actions are a direct correlation with our interpretation of a circumstance. So I like to look at a circumstance like a prior failure is a circumstance. It happened one time in history. It has no power over the future. It has no likelihood of repeating itself unless we allow it to. Now, if my negative self-talk is telling me, because I failed this test before, I stand a chance of failing it again, and I go in the line of that, I'm more likely to produce actions that keep me grounded in that failure. So that would be self-doubt, because if you're studying from a place of self-doubt, you're not confident every time you look at your answer options. You're overthinking yourself. You know the right answer now, but you cannot move past your past failure to just select the right answer. You talk yourself out of it time and time again, and then you find yourself repeating the failure. Maybe the first time your failure was because of a lack of knowledge, which was fairly understandable, but you've worked hard and you've been able to put in the hours. You've implemented active studying, which you talked about yesterday during the live, versus passive studying, which you're saying, I no longer do that. However, instead of like actually producing results, you are no longer able to produce good results this time, no longer because your knowledge base is lacking, but now it's as a result of that negative self-talk that was built from the prior failure. So it's important that you make a distinction between, have I put in the effort to make a difference between my step 1 score and my step 2 score, or my step 2 score and my step 3 score? Because that trajectory, that change matters. When you don't do well on one exam and you're able to do extremely well in the next exam, programs recognize that. They recognize that improvement, and that is usually a talking point that I recommend for students in my IMG Roadmap course to include in their personal statements, to find ways to talk about the academic improvements that they've achieved. Because that shows that you're a learner, you're progressive, and you implement change, and you will grow. So when I have you as a resident of my program, I know that I'll experience growth with you. And that's what makes a great learner. It's not getting a high score consistently. It's showing a track record of growth. Okay. Thank you so much. Hassan says my talk is better than CBT. Maybe I should start offering CBT, right? But I'm not a licensed therapist. But back to negative self-talk. So what can we do about negative self-talk? I'll tell you one thing that I did for myself, and it's the silliest thing ever, but it worked so well for me. What I did was, because I knew my self-talk was kind of defaulted to a certain way, and I've talked about this before. I'm from West Africa, and the system I grew up in was just very different in the sense of, you know, people are categorized as smart from birth, and then some other people are categorized as stupid from birth, you know, and then you just kind of fall in this loophole of where you're considered average even when you're good. You know what I mean? And so scarcity mindset becomes a part of your life when you grow up in a society like that. And you don't realize it, but you're living your life based off other people's definitions of you. And you never really achieve your full potential because you're always being limited by things that even people that loved you talked about you, you know, in your presence. So back to one thing that I did when I was working on my step 2 CK, because I was not impressed with my step 1 score. I did not like it. I was so embarrassed by it. I never said it out loud because it brought me such shame, right? And I know some of you can relate with that. Back then we had 2-digit scores, and mine was what they call 89th percentile, meaning I scored in the 89th percentile of everyone who took the test with me. And that was not competitive. Competitive then was the 99th percentile. And it's equivalent to kind of the feeling people get now when they score 240 and above, right? So coming from that, I knew I wanted a 99th percentile to be competitive for residency. And one of the things that I did was I wrote down all the thoughts that I had regarding my negative self-talk. So you're not a good test taker, you overthink, you are, you know, slow to pick the right answer, you don't have a good fund of medical knowledge. All these things that I thought about myself, I would write them down. And then I turned around and I wrote what I wanted for myself. So that was different from what I was telling myself, but what I knew I needed to hear. And when I was able to transition from what I knew about myself to what I wanted to be, then it changes from I'm a negative, or I'm a poor test taker, to I am diligent with picking the right answer. Because that's a big difference between being a poor test taker and being diligent with saying, I'm going to pick the right answer using a strategy. I'm going to use the process of elimination if I'm not sure or uncertain. And I'm going to explain to myself why this answer is correct before I move forward, such that I'm making the selection based on fact and not my thoughts, not my feelings. Because if you can explain why the answer is incorrect, you're more likely to no longer doubt yourself because you're not going off of your own feelings. You're going off of what the fact is, right? So you want to write down these thoughts that I consider the automatic negative thoughts, the ants in our head, the ANTs, automatic negative thoughts, okay? They're like little ants in your brain telling you all these things. Write them down on one side of a piece of paper, right? So you take a piece of paper like this, you write the automatic negative thoughts on one side. And then on the other side, you write the thoughts that you need to have to succeed, which are the thoughts that you know are beneficial for your growth and for your psychological well-being, right? And then you remove those positive thoughts or the thoughts that are more likely to foster growth and enhancement, and you type them up and blow them up and put them on your wall. Okay, so that's what I did. I put it up on my wall. I put it up in the bathroom next to where I brush my teeth every morning. And I also took my dream score that I wanted, blew it up, and also put it up right next to it. So that when I wake up in the morning, there's something else pushing me. There's some other drive beyond just those automatic negative thoughts. And over time, I began to embody the kind of person who enjoyed medicine, who enjoyed reading her book, who enjoyed learning concepts on CK. My approach to the question bank was no longer, I just want to get the right answer. It was like, what is the educational objective? What am I missing? What is the test taker asking of me? What concept do they need me to be able to differentiate between these answer options so I can pick the right answer? Because when you begin to think about medicine like that, like I said yesterday, it becomes super enjoyable. It becomes much less stressful, and you're more likely to default away from shame to progress, to growth. Okay? So the third thing that you'll do about test taking anxiety, which is just as important, and it's amazing because we're all studying to be, some of us are even already physicians in our home country or in another third-party country where we went to med school. But it's important that you are taking care of yourself before and during the examination. So we all know that if you eat protein, for example, the day of your exam, you're less likely to have hypoglycemic crashes by hour 4 or hour 3 of your test. And this is for non-diabetics, people who have no other medical issues, right? Like most of us. So if you are snacking on sugary snacks on exam day, it is going to cause a crash in your blood sugar because you're going to have this big spike and then this big drop later on. And that drop is not helpful for your cognitive processing, right? But before you go to test day, you want to be able to replicate the kind of steady glucose state that you need to survive a 9-hour testing day. So that means you should be prioritizing protein in your diet way beforehand. If you're the kind of person who drinks caffeine and gets jittery, sweaty, maybe you stop coffee a week or two before the exam so that you can get past the headaches, you can get past the withdrawals and whatnot, and be able to show up on test day, not relying on caffeine for fuel, because that would lead to a crash by hour 5 or 6. So I hope you get where we're heading with this. Your physiologic state will determine your mental stamina on exam day. So many of us, if we could see our scores based on how we perform on block 1 versus block 6 or 7, you probably notice that you're getting questions wrong at the end of the test that you would not otherwise get wrong if you took them in the first few hours of the test, which I think the changes that are coming with the USMLE are going to be great because maybe those shorter blocks would help with attention span. It would help with, stamina for the exam day. And I think it will be a good thing overall, those changes that they're making with the structure of the exam. The content's not changing, just the structure. So, test taking anxiety, we've talked about a few things for those of you who are just joining in. We went in depth with just some overcoming the automatic negative thoughts, the inner dialogue that we have. And the key there is using self-compassion, creating schedule, time management, and then we were just talking about what we do with our bodies, the wellness portion to be able to build the mental stamina for exam day. And last but not least, if you need help, it's okay to seek help. I know somebody who has I want to say like along the spectrum of dyslexia, but maybe not quite that. I don't remember the diagnosis, but she got formally evaluated for this and was able to ask for accommodations from the USMLE, and I would say that's from the FSMB and the NBME. And what they did was they allowed her to take the exam under different circumstances, so allowing her a little bit more time per block. It's a rigorous process. You have to be tested and you have to prove that there is indeed a problem, and for them to give you those necessary accommodations. But if all else fails, remember that, and this person's an IMG, so if all else fails, remember that you have the opportunity to veto or fight for these other privileges. Obviously, because it's time consuming to get through the process, the testing, the analysis that you have to go through with behavioral health, psychometricians, test taking specialists, just to prove that point, you may as well just study and just go take the test. However, if you're that person that knows that you need some help, there's nothing wrong with asking and taking that help. I just want to remind you guys, my giveaway is still open. I'm giving away 1 QBank to 1 IMG. I'll announce the results next Monday. It's random. So in order to enter, you have to either send me a DM with the word giveaway, and it will prompt you. So I have a bot that's collecting the information from me because I just cannot collect the information from everybody. So it will prompt you to give some answers to some questions, and then it will tell you when you are entered. So if you want to win that, please participate by DMing giveaway to me or to the IMG Roadmap page. And the reason I'm doing this giveaway is I saw a big difference when I used this particular QBank when I was studying. It's not sponsored. I'm not doing it on behalf of anybody. This is a QBank that I know helped me. And this brings me to my last point, which is you have to know the kind of learner that you are. And some of us are taking advice, and you may be listening to this live and you're like, her advice will not work for me. And perfectly fine, okay? Nothing wrong with that. But remember this, you need to know the kind of learner that you are. The kind of learner you are is very different from the kind of learner your brother is, your sister is, your mom is, or your dad is. Some of us are visual. Some of us do well with understanding textbooks. Everybody can understand a textbook, so everybody should be reading a textbook at some point in time. However, paced repetition is the key with scoring high on standardized multiple choice exams. Meaning you need to be able to see these concepts repeat themselves over space and time. So you see it on day 1, you see it on day 20, you see it again on day 25, day 35, day 45, up until day 90 of your study. Because the more times you're exposed to a concept, the more likely you are to retain the concept. And spaced repetition can be achieved through question banks. So active learning, stimulating critical thinking and critical reasoning. It can also be achieved through flashcards and other methods of note-taking. However, more important than anything, if you're making notes, like I talked about yesterday in the live, I gave you guys my strategy for making notes. It's useless to make notes and never read them. Because what's the point? You should be able to take notes and make time to review them. And I recommend strongly taking notes in your own handwriting as opposed to maybe typing notes or using somebody else's flashcards that they've made or somebody else's notes that they've created. When you can create your own notes, you're more likely, again, to remember what you wrote because of the idea of spaced repetition. Your brain and the hand-to-brain memory of writing it down is super, super important in retention. And like I mentioned yesterday, for me, I'm an audiovisual learner. So I learned from a really in-depth video of someone teaching me a concept that I don't understand. For example, physiology, Frank's Starting Law, and some of the other basic concepts of physiology took me a while in medical school to learn because I needed to sit through Conrad Fisher's videos 3-4 times, slowing it down at 0.8x to be able to really get the concept down, right? And then there are other videos like psych videos that I could listen to at 1.5x or 2x even, because I could answer those correctly every single time. Why waste my time there? I knew my weakest discipline was physio, so I spend more time in physio than anything else. And once I was able to get my score in physio from being a 50% every time block that I was doing to an 80%, then when I did random questions, because physio was the one I was always failing, I saw a jump in my overall score at the end of the day. So do you see why I recommend that you work on your weakest areas first? So Anki for space repetition, Jemima, absolutely. If that's what you like, you use that. A lot of people speak highly about Anki. I personally don't have any experience with Anki flashcards because it was not present when I was taking my USMLE. But I know students in my program, in the IMG roadmap that I've coached, they all rave about things like Anki, Sketchy for micro. They rave about UWorld for QBanks. I think UWorld is a universal tool for US grads and even foreign grads together. So I definitely think that those help. Now, for video resources, there's several of them as well that you can use. At the end of the day, it's whoever makes you or helps you understand the concepts with such ease and breaks it down to a 5th grade level for you. So yeah, great question. How did I do space repetition since Anki wasn't popular in my time? I made my own flashcards. So I made my own flashcards and I made my own notes. I did use first aid for my review. So that was like after my first pass of UWorld. But I was going to grab post-it notes, but this is not what I used. I used index cards that they used to sell at the dollar store. You know those index cards that are white and they have lines on them? Like they use them in like elementary school for kids. I used index cards to make my own flashcards. And then when I realized that the flashcards were really working, I bought the ones that had glue on the back end just so I could stick them on places. But yeah, that's how I did it. And yesterday during the live, I also shared that I bought these dollar store spiral bound books, and I still use them till today. And I made one for each discipline, specifically my weakest discipline. So for CK, what I did was I had one for physio, one for path, one for farm, and then cardio. I made one for cardio as a discipline because that was like a weak area of mine, and it was a highly tested area for CK. And when I would do the educational when I would do a question in tutor mode, first pass of UWorld, I would do tutor mode and I read through the question stem, eliminate the answers, and then pick the answer that I thought was right based on my elimination and my thinking through it. Once I click on that, once it shows me my educational objective, I made a note about what the NBME wants me to learn. NBME wants me to know how to determine a difference between heart failure with reduced ejection fraction versus heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, right? And the fact that this patient came in with RALs, with pedal edema, with positive JVD, with low blood pressure, whatever, all those factors in the stem is what they want me to pick up about this condition. So I would make a note now in my cardio book, if it was a cardio concept, or my physio book, because that could go either way, about the educational objective. And then for all the other incorrect answers, if they were incorrect for this question, I'll ask myself, what would make it the right answer? Or what is the right answer for, if it was the right answer for another question? And I would write that. And I lived in Chicago then. So there was a long commute for me every morning to go to clinicals or rotations. I'm a Caribbean medical student, or I was a Caribbean medical student. So we did all our clinicals in like different US cities, which is why I love coaching Caribbean medical students, because our schools do not set us up for success. They literally, and I'm not going to get in that soapbox because it's not the point of this live right now. But some of them are profit-generating machines that do not care about our well-being. They don't care about our academic progress, so you're on your own, literally. But anyways, I digress. So I would take my spiral-bound notebook with me on the train, on the bus, which was an hour commute sometimes if I was leaving from where I live to go to a hospital on the west side or the north side or south side or wherever. And that's where I would do my space repetition, which is where I'm looking at my flashcards, looking at my notes during my commute. For some of you, you may have a job or whatever you're doing that you can take your notes with you, your flashcards with you, and you can do them throughout the day while you're waiting on something or after classes. You just find pockets of time throughout the day where you can just review the concepts that you have already studied. So that brings me to the end of our live today, which kind of just really focused more on test taking anxiety. And the key, I think, with testing anxiety is the internal dialogue. One thing that I also know has helped me tremendously with changing my negative self-talk is self-compassion. And what I love about AI these days is you can go into AI. So somebody said, what if you can't afford CBT? You can go into AI and say, this is my internal self-dialogue right now, or this is my inner dialogue, this is my self-critic talking right now, and it's saying that I don't stand a chance step 2 because I failed step 1, or because I didn't pass my comp, and so I'm worried that this is going to happen again, or my NBME performance is low. Give me the self-compassion phrase to tell myself in this scenario. I'm pretty sure one of these AI apps can give you some self-compassion phrases. But self-compassion, the way I think about it is, self-compassion is what I would tell my friend, right? If my friend came to me with this particular problem. So if a friend of mine asked me, hey, I'm failing my exams, what to do? I'm not going to say you're a bad test taker. I would never say that to a friend that I care about. But why is it easy for me to tell myself that? Why? I don't know. Like, why do we think it's okay to talk to ourselves like that? Like, why do we think it's okay to tell ourselves things that we will not tell our friends, and we will not encourage our friends with that? Some of you are really great at it. You will encourage somebody else to the wall. Like, go do it, girl. You can do it. But you can't talk to yourself like that. So if you can't do that, probably something you need to do is consider writing it down, adding it on as one of those things that you're going to do when you're shifting your self-dialogue from that negative inner self-critic to a more uplifting growth mindset tone, where you're like, okay, I'm going to move away from consistently telling myself I'm a bad test taker to working on what are the weakest areas on my UWorld QBank that I need to be focused on. If it's physio, we're going to do physio. If it's path, we're going to do path. That's more progressive than sitting there and ruminating in your own dialogue. So self-compassion is, the way I describe it to myself is how I would talk to my friend when they reached out to me with the same problem. And then I tell myself exactly that. Because as hard as it is to give yourself grace, when you think of yourself as how you think of someone else you love, it's easier to maybe come up with the words or the right words to say. So that brings us to the end of our life. If you have any questions, feel free to slide in my DMs. Let's talk about your individual circumstance. I don't see any other questions in the question box here anymore. So let's see if I missed any questions. Yeah, I don't think I missed any questions. If you have a question, please feel free to ask before I get off. I'm just waving at every one of you. And don't forget that you can enter that giveaway and you'll be able to use the credit that we're giving away towards any of your QBank step 1, step 2, or step 3. So I think that's it. I don't see a question. Oh yes, Shano, this video will be on my page on Instagram, and usually I repost it on my YouTube page as well, all my Instagram lives, because people are more likely to, you can navigate better on YouTube if you didn't know that. When I post a video on Instagram, I post it on YouTube, because on YouTube you can skip forward, you can see chapters, you can navigate things a lot better than you can on Instagram. So I'll also post it on there. And I have another series of webinars coming up this spring, so don't miss out on that. If you are applying into residency anytime soon, I want to make sure that you guys are equipped with the information that you need. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.